Behind me is Toronto Pearson International Airport, the main airport serving Toronto. There's been an airport on this site since the late 1930s, yet it wasn't until 2015 that you could do something that is taken for granted at many major airports around the world. Get to and from the airport on a train. What's up with that? Despite serving Toronto, this airport actually isn't in Toronto, other than a small portion in one corner. And it wasn't even supposed to be the main airport for Toronto. Let's talk about the history. Behind me is Billy Bishop Toronto City Airport. It made an appearance in my earlier video on how Toronto's shoreline has changed over the last several thousand years. There's a magic link up here, and I'll put a link down in the description so you can find it when you finish watching this video. There have been proposals for some sort of aviation facility at this location since about 1929. City Council approved an air harbor for seaplanes only, with the explicit condition that they did not approve an airport for land-based aircraft. But in 1935, the federal government dangled some money in front of the city to build an airport here and a tunnel to connect it to the mainland. The city said yes to the money and started digging a hole for the tunnel. Later that year, after a change in the federal government, they took the money away, and so the city filled in the hole. If that sounds a lot like what happened with the Eglinton West subway in the 1990s, you're not wrong. And just as eventually we did dig a tunnel along Eglinton for a subway line or an underground LRT line, so too did a tunnel eventually get built here, opening in 2015, just 80 years after the original tunnel construction began. In 1936, at the urging of the federal government, the city began a study to find locations for an airport for Toronto. They came up with 2 locations, and the federal government agreed to provide funding for both of them. One of them was in Malton, the location of today's Pearson International Airport. But that was supposed to be a secondary airport, and this was supposed to be the primary one. After all, remember, back in those days, Toronto was much smaller than it is today. And while this airport is nice and close to downtown, Malton was in the middle of nowhere. Also, there's that whole seaplane thing, although it looks like that turned out to be less important than they might have thought.
But let's get back to Pearson. The airport here was approved in 1937, and the government set about buying up the farms whose land would become the airfield. The first plane landed in 1938, and the first scheduled passenger flight was in 1939. In today's era of infrastructure projects that take a decade or longer, that sounds incredibly fast, but then again, it was a much more primitive airport. Heck, the first terminal building was just the farmhouse of one of the farms, and the second one was a wooden structure that was basically a twin of the one that was built at the island airport at about the same time. For obvious reasons, aircraft factories need to be located at airports, and that happened at Pearson too, which turned out to be quite useful when World War II broke out just a few days after that first scheduled passenger flight. Not only that we could build aircraft here, but unlike British factories, it was far from the reach of German bombers. We'll get back to the factory thing in a bit. Now, as for rail, what sorts of rail links do other airports have? Well, let's start with the big gun, high-speed rail. Only a few airports are connected to their national high-speed rail networks. High-speed rail sounds nice to get you between the airport and downtown quickly, but high-speed rail is really about covering much longer distances than the distance between a city center and its airport. Plus, over a short distance, high-speed rail isn't going to save you all that much time versus regular rail, and if it's part of a longer high-speed rail line, it slows everyone else's journeys down as the train has to stop at the airport. Anyway, Toronto obviously doesn't have this because there's no high-speed rail in Canada. We have a lot of practice at doing studies about high-speed rail, we do one every few years, but we've never actually gotten around to building any. A more common rail connection to major airports, and the next step down, is the regular national rail network. In Canada, that's Via Rail. There's even a line running right past one corner of the airport, and there was actually a rail spur running to the factories in this corner of the airfield, since rail is a great way to get parts and materials in. That spur existed until a few decades ago, and if you've ever been to any events at the International Centre and wondered about this strange walkway, well, the rail spur used to run through the arches, and the enclosure for the walkway was retractable. I remember that when I was a kid, and I also remember the railroad crossing on Airport Road between here and the factory. From what I understand, at least one building of the International Centre was originally part of the factory complex for Avro and its corporate relative Orenda Engines. And if you've seen any of the famous pictures of the Avro Arrow being rolled out of a factory, or the planes being cut up on the tarmac after the government cancelled the project, those were in front of the factory across the street. Anyway, the passenger terminals at Pearson are farther from the rail line and have never been connected. And since only a few via trains a day go past here, it wouldn't be much use anyway unless there was a major increase in rail service on this line. One more step down, and also a very common connection for major airports, is regional or commuter rail. In Toronto, that's GO Transit. And GO offers service along that very same rail line, but again, it doesn't connect to the passenger terminals. And a major part of GO train service is still the same thing it was originally for: people commuting between their homes in the suburbs and their work in the city. That affects not only routing, but also scheduling. Put that thought on pause for a moment.
Next is what we actually ended up getting: a rail link between the airport and the city. There have been a number of proposals for this sort of thing going back a few decades. Obstacles included wrangling between levels of government and potential private operators, and opposition from communities along the way that would see a large increase in the number of trains rumbling by. Opposition was perhaps strongest here in Weston, where a number of streets cross the tracks at level crossings. That would obviously be inconvenient and also unsafe with a huge increase in the number of trains going by. Proposals to cut those streets in two, leaving dead ends on either side of the tracks, went over about as well as you might expect. Making things even worse was the notion that these trains would be operated using diesel vehicles with the noise and pollution that they emit, rather than the quieter and cleaner electric vehicles. In 2010, the provincial government decided it would just take over the project on its own. It was a pretty big project, including a number of grade separations, and even replacing a diamond crossing between two train lines in the Junction neighborhood. That diamond crossing got a mention in my video on the West Toronto Rail Path. Links in the usual places. And then there's this.
The spur line that runs from the main line to the airport was built for this project. Much of it is elevated, and it offers a rather nice view, especially if it's a clearer day than it was when I shot this video. For the best view, you'll want to be on the south side of the train. That's the left side if you're heading to the airport, or the right side if you're heading into town. The Union Pearson, or Up Express, runs frequently, every 15 minutes, and it does the trip in 25 minutes, even though it has some stops along the way. When it first opened, the fare was reportedly the most expensive of any airport link service in North America, and not surprisingly, ridership was low. They reduced the fare substantially a couple of years later, and ridership went up. The fare depends on distance, so this line also serves as a local commuter rail line with connections to the Toronto Transit system. The vehicles are DMUs, diesel multiple units, which is part of what the community opposed. They are designed to be convertible to electric operation, but that hasn't happened, and I suspect that any such change would be far enough in the future that the vehicles will be replaced rather than undergoing this sort of modification when they'll already be fairly late in their design lifetime. Pearson does have this other thing that sort of has rails, the terminal link Peoplemover. It even predates the Up Express. Technically, it's not a rail vehicle. It has regular wheels and rubber tires that run on top of a guideway, along with additional wheels that keep it from running off the side. It's pulled by a long cable that's attached to the vehicles, and like Peoplemover systems at many other airports, it doesn't go far. It runs between Pearson's two terminals, which of course are numbered 1 and 3, and a parking garage just outside the airport. The total length is only about 1.5 kilometers.
And then there's the Eglinton Crosstown LRT. I did a video about that too. You know where to find the links. The original proposal for this line had it going all the way out to the airport, but that got cut back to reduce costs. Even though the first phase still hasn't opened, there is already a westward expansion under construction, but that too falls short of the airport. There's still hope that this line might eventually reach the airport though. We'll talk about that in a bit.
As for the subway, the closest point on the subway system is Kipling Station, which is several kilometers from the airport, so it would be a big project to extend that. Plus, the logical extension of that line is west into Mississauga, not north to the airport. If the Shepherd Line is ever extended to the west, it might come closer, but bringing that to the airport will be a long extension through areas that don't have the density to justify a subway. If you're interested in the Shepherd Line, I did a video about that. Yada yada yada.
So that's where we're at. The international airport serving the country's largest city has a dedicated airport rail link train, but no connection to any other form of higher order transit. So, what could we have done? Well, there's that rail line that runs past the corner of the airport. It's in the wrong place, but we're not the only city to have faced that problem, and some other cities have solved it, sometimes by tunneling a rail line under the airport. That's what London did with Heathrow. Heathrow has an airport link service, much like ours, but it's also on the Elizabeth line, which is part of their equivalent to GO Transit, and it's on the Piccadilly line of the London Underground. And each of those three rail services stops at more than one terminal, as opposed to what we have here that only goes to one terminal, and then you have to take the Peoplemover to get to the other one. Now, it's only fair to point out, London is obviously a much bigger city than Toronto, but the city of Toronto alone, not even including the metropolitan area, has a population greater than the metropolitan area of Zurich, Switzerland. And yet, when they faced the same problem, having a rail line that was a couple of kilometers away from the airport, they solved it pretty much the same way that London did. They put a tunnel under the airport, and their airport is now connected to the regional transit system and to the national rail system. Could we do that? Well, there's probably no technical reason that we couldn't do what other cities have already done. It's just, it would be really expensive, probably in the billions of dollars. That takes a lot of political will. The city of Toronto is perpetually short on cash, so they're not going to do it, and especially, they're not going to pay the whole shot for a service that would serve more than just the city, but the entire urban area. The airport is run by the Greater Toronto Airport Authority, and it's already one of the most expensive major international airports in the world. If they were to pay for the airport link, that would just make that even more expensive. That's not going to fly. The provincial government, well, they might throw in some money for that, but probably only if all the other levels of government chip in as well. And as for the federal government, no matter which party is in power, spending large amounts of money on Ontario, and especially on Toronto, tends to be politically unpopular. What we may get is a transit hub just outside the airport, where the Peoplemover currently serves a parking garage. There are plans for a second extension of the Eglinton Crosstown LRT to this location, as well as buses and GO trains and the Finch West LRT, oh my. It's still in the design stages, but they're talking about having it open hopefully by around 2027. And I'm being told it's been delayed to the early 2030s. Because of course it's delayed. It's a transit project in Toronto. If you see that on any of the betting sites, maybe take the over. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, you know what to do. Please like and subscribe.